When construction workers broke ground for Governor Grimes's new building on the corner of Main and Valley Streets in Iowa, they expected to dig a simple foundation. What they found beneath the prairie soil would challenge everything historians claimed about pre-European America. And then, just as quickly as the discovery emerged, it vanished from official records forever. At first, the workers assumed they'd hit a natural rock formation, or old settlers' cellar. But as they cleared more earth, something deliberately constructed began to emerge. The edges were too precise, too geometric to be natural. The stonework showed clear evidence of sophisticated human engineering. Foreman Charles Henderson described the sophisticated stonework as unlike anything he'd seen in 15 years of frontier construction. The precision, mathematics, and load distribution understanding suggested builders with advanced engineering knowledge. The mortar binding the stones resisted their strongest tools, seeming impossibly advanced for frontier construction. This wasn't supposed to exist there. Iowa in 1856 was barely settled territory, yet 10 feet below the surface, workers struck something that defied explanation. An arched vault 10 feet square constructed with 14-inch thick walls and mortar so durable, the workmen described it as indestructible. Inside that vault lay 8 human skeletons, not ordinary remains. Skeletons measuring between 8 and 12 feet in length, preserved with obvious care, arranged with deliberate intention. The local newspaper reported it once matter-of-factly, almost casually. Then the story disappeared. No follow-up articles. No scientific examination, no official investigation. Just silence. The pattern begins here. Because what happened in Iowa wasn't isolated. It was part of a systematic erasure that swept across America throughout the 1800s. Giant skeletal remains discovered, briefly documented, then buried again, both literally and figuratively. The construction crew initially tried to rationalize what they'd found. Perhaps an old storage vault from earlier settlers. But as they cleared more earth, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why would anyone build a vault beneath virgin prairie? Why construct it with such permanence, with walls thick enough to withstand centuries of pressure? Why use mortar that seemed more advanced than anything frontier Iowa possessed? And the question that troubled even the most practical workmen: why were the remains inside so enormous? The vault itself demonstrated sophisticated engineering knowledge. Arch construction requires precise understanding of load distribution and force dynamics. This wasn't a simple burial pit dug by nomadic tribes. This was permanent architecture, built to endure, built to protect its contents across vast spans of time. The 14-inch walls weren't decorative. That is fortress-level construction, designed to bear immense weight, to resist the crushing pressure of earth and time. And the mortar, described by witnesses as indestructible, suggests knowledge of advanced binding agents that don't appear in any documentation of who supposedly built on that ground. As workers carefully entered the vault, they discovered something that would haunt their conversations for decades. 8 human skeletons, arranged in perfect rows, each measuring between 8 and 12 feet from skull to pelvis. But these weren't the scattered, disorganized bones typical of disturbed burial sites. These remains showed clear evidence of intentional, ceremonial placement. Dr. Samuel Mitchell, a traveling physician summoned to examine the findings, provided the most detailed account in his private correspondence. Mitchell noted perfectly proportioned human remains, scaled up uniformly across all bone structures. The skull measurements showed nearly double normal cranial capacity, yet maintained mathematically consistent proportions. The femur bones measured over 4 feet in length. The rib cages were so expansive a normal person could fit inside one. Despite their size, the bones showed no signs of genetic disorders or structural weakness typically associated with growth abnormalities. Most disturbing were the trauma marks on several skeletons. Deep gouges around skulls and torsos suggested violent death from weapons that left marks unlike anything in Mitchell's medical experience. Copper ornaments and advanced metallurgy tools found alongside the remains featured techniques that shouldn't have existed in pre-Columbian America. Mitchell's correspondence describes spending 3 days examining the contents of the vault before local authorities insisted the site be sealed and construction resumed. His detailed measurements, sketches, and observations represent the only scientific documentation of what may have been one of America's most significant archaeological discoveries. These weren't scattered bones from some ancient battlefield. These were complete skeletons, laid out with obvious intention, preserved with clear purpose. This was formal burial, conducted by a society with resources, knowledge, and motivation to construct permanent architecture for their dead. The preservation itself tells a story. The vault had succeeded in its apparent purpose. The remains were protected from decay, from the elements, from the passage of time. Whoever built this chamber understood exactly what they were doing. The engineering worked. But here is what makes the Iowa discovery especially troubling for conventional narratives. If these measurements were accurate, if these remains truly ranged from 8 to 12 feet in length, then we're looking at evidence of a human population that doesn't fit anywhere in the accepted timeline of North American prehistory. Official archaeology later dismissed such accounts as frontier exaggeration, misidentified animal bones, or simple hoaxes. But nothing about the 1856 Iowa discovery fits that pattern. This wasn't a lone skeleton found by an unreliable witness. This was 8 skeletons discovered by multiple workmen, examined by enough people that a newspaper felt confident reporting specific measurements. And as news of the discovery should have spread, something peculiar began happening. The story didn't grow. It contracted. No scientific expeditions arrived. No Smithsonian representatives appeared. No follow-up articles described what happened to the skeletons or the structure that housed them. Mitchell's documentation didn't survive intact. When his family donated his papers in 1987, crucial pages had been systematically removed. Sketches of skeletal measurements were gone. Anatomical observations cut out with surgical precision. Family members reported no signs of natural deterioration. The missing sections appeared deliberately excised. This pattern repeats across dozens of similar discoveries. Complete newspaper archives with specific issues missing. Medical journals with articles removed. University collections with specimens vanishing from catalogs. The gaps are too precise to represent random loss. Consider what happened to the physical evidence from Iowa. Local records indicate that several artifacts from the vault were initially preserved by townspeople who helped with the excavation. Copper ornaments, unusual tools, fragments of the advanced mortar that had puzzled the construction workers. These items were reportedly displayed in local businesses and private homes for several years after the discovery. Then they began disappearing. Not all at once, but gradually, systematically. A copper bracelet vanished from a general store display case. Ancient tools disappeared from a blacksmith's collection. The mortar samples, which had been kept by several different families, were somehow lost during routine household moves or estate transitions. By 1900, less than 50 years after the discovery, no physical evidence remained in Iowa. The artifacts hadn't been sold or donated to museums. They had simply vanished from private collections, from family heirlooms, from the material culture of the community that had witnessed their discovery. But the Iowa discovery wasn't isolated. Throughout the 1800s, similar finds kept appearing in local newspapers, then vanishing from official records. Wisconsin, 1891. Investigators reported finding enormous burial mounds containing skeletons of unusual size. The remains were sent to Washington, never displayed, never studied publicly, never mentioned again. The New York Times, 1885. 7-foot skeleton discovered in Michigan mound. The San Diego Union, 1895. Bones of extraordinary size found during railroad excavation. These weren't tabloid sensations, but mainstream newspapers reporting what was considered newsworthy at the time. The accounts consistently describe skeletons measuring 7 to 12 feet, found in organized burial sites with artifacts challenging assumptions about pre-Columbian America. Then, around 1920, these reports stopped appearing abruptly. The transition was so systematic, it suggests coordination rather than coincidence. What is more disturbing is what happened to physical evidence already collected. Many specimens had been sent to the Smithsonian Institution for further study. The Smithsonian now claims no such skeletons exist in their collections. Missing, lost, misplaced during routine transfers. Hundreds of specimens all vanished without proper documentation. The pattern becomes impossible to ignore when you examine the timing. Giant discoveries peak in the late 1800s, the same period when institutional archaeology was establishing itself as a legitimate science. The same period when universities were creating anthropology departments with specific theories about human development and migration patterns. Those theories required Native American populations to have arrived recently via the Bering Land Bridge, to have developed in isolation, to have built nothing permanent before European contact. Giant skeletons suggested different populations, different timelines, different technological capabilities. They created problems for emerging academic consensus. Ohio saw dozens of newspaper accounts throughout the century describing the opening of ancient mounds revealing skeletons measuring 7 to 9 feet in length. Many included detailed descriptions of sophisticated burial practices and advanced metallurgy. Most disappeared within months of discovery. Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania. The pattern repeats across the continent. Local discoveries, brief newspaper mentions, then systematic silence. The remains vanish, the mounds get destroyed by farming or development. The evidence disappears before systematic study can occur. When you map these discoveries, something disturbing becomes apparent. They cluster along major river valleys, in locations suggesting a widespread population, not scattered anomalies. They appear in engineered burial structures, not simple graves. They show evidence of advanced construction knowledge and cultural practices that don't match any recognized tradition. Consider the massive tools found alongside these remains. Wrenches measuring 4 to 6 feet in length, designed for hands much larger than ours, for operators with extraordinary grip strength. Museums catalog them as industrial equipment without explaining what processes would require 200-pound tools. Estate auctions regularly feature oversized furniture from the 1800s, chairs with seat heights measuring 36 inches, nearly double normal standards. These weren't decorative pieces, but functional furniture scaled for occupants of extraordinary size. The architectural evidence becomes even more compelling when examined systematically. Government buildings from the 1700s and 1800s feature doorways 12 to 15 feet high, not at grand entrances where such proportions might serve ceremonial purposes, but in working corridors, in back offices, in spaces where functionality should outweigh grandeur. Staircases with risers so tall that normal people must stretch uncomfortably to climb them. Furniture, desks, and beds found in estate sales and museums, all slightly too large, all dismissed as custom, made for tall individuals. But it is not just one building. It is thousands across America, Europe, and Asia, all featuring the same oversized proportions. What happened to the Iowa giants and hundreds of similar discoveries wasn't accidental neglect. It was systematic suppression through institutional gatekeeping. Museums and universities had clear narratives about American prehistory. Native populations arrived relatively recently, developed in isolation, built nothing permanent before European contact. Any discovery challenging this narrative created problems. Giant skeletons suggested different populations, different timelines, different stories entirely. So those discoveries were archived in ways making them inaccessible, stored where they wouldn't be displayed, or simply lost in vast collections where they could be forgotten. This wasn't active destruction. It was passive erasure, the kind that happens when institutions decide certain questions aren't worth asking, certain evidence isn't worth preserving, certain chapters of history aren't worth telling. When you examine what the Iowa discovery actually showed, independent of later dismissals, a clear pattern emerges: sophisticated construction methods, permanent architecture, burial practices, suggesting social organization and cultural complexity, and human remains of unprecedented size. The vault demonstrated advanced engineering. The arch design required understanding force distribution. The 14-inch walls suggested experience with load-bearing construction. The indestructible mortar indicated material science knowledge exceeding anything attributed to Iowa's pre-European inhabitants. The skeletons demonstrated something equally troubling for accepted timelines. 8 individuals of exceptional size, all buried together with clear cultural intention. Not individuals with medical conditions, but what appeared to be a population, multiple people, all of extraordinary proportions, all treated with obvious reverence. And the preservation suggested whoever built the vault succeeded completely. The bodies were protected. The chamber held. The engineering worked across centuries, possibly millennia of burial. This brings us to questions no official archive has ever answered satisfactorily. What happened to the 8 skeletons discovered in Iowa in 1856? Were they reburied when construction continued? Were they sent to private collections? Were they deliberately destroyed to eliminate evidence contradicting preferred narratives? We don't know because no institutional authority chose to create clear records. The same pattern repeats everywhere: discovery, brief documentation, then systematic forgetting. Why was a sophisticated burial vault constructed beneath Iowa prairie? Who possessed the engineering knowledge to build permanent architecture with arched ceilings and indestructible mortar? Why were 8 individuals of gigantic proportions buried together with such obvious care? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're evidence gaps conventional archaeology has never adequately addressed, choosing instead to dismiss entire categories of discoveries, rather than engage with specific evidence each case presents. When you examine the Iowa discovery alongside hundreds of similar finds from the 1800s, a disturbing possibility emerges. What if North America was inhabited by populations we no longer acknowledge? What if those populations built permanent structures, developed advanced construction techniques, achieved cultural sophistication that doesn't appear in accepted timelines? What if the mounds scattered across the Midwest aren't simple burial hills, but remnants of architectural complexes that were systematically dismantled, plowed under, erased by European expansion? What if the giant skeletons aren't anomalies, but evidence of distinct populations that existed before, during, or alongside ancestors of modern tribes? The evidence exists, but in fragments. Newspaper accounts never followed up. Museum collections never cataloged. Discoveries buried again before systematic study could occur. It exists in gaps, in silences, in questions institutional archaeology chose not to ask. The workmen who discovered the Iowa vault had choices. They could have stopped construction, called for scientific examination, preserved the structure and contents for systematic study. Instead, they filled it back in, continued building. Let the discovery fade into local folklore. This wasn't malicious. It was practical. The frontier economy didn't allow for archaeological delays. In 1856, there was no framework for understanding what had been found, no institutions ready to preserve it. But what is harder to explain is why later generations didn't return to investigate. Why no archaeological teams excavated the site searching for remaining evidence? Why the discovery remained a footnote rather than becoming a catalyst for deeper questions about Iowa's prehistory? The answer might be uncomfortable. If the Iowa giants were real, if the measurements were accurate, if the vault demonstrated advanced engineering, then accepted stories of North American prehistory begin to collapse. Sometimes, it is easier to preserve simple narratives than acknowledge evidence demanding complete revision of historical understanding. The Iowa discovery wasn't just an odd frontier find. It was a glimpse into a version of history we were never meant to see. For one brief moment in 1856, the earth beneath Iowa opened enough to reveal 8 skeletons of gigantic proportions, preserved in a vault that shouldn't exist, built by hands we can no longer identify. Instead of studying it, they covered it again, filled it, built over it, forgot it. Because if Iowa was home to a civilization of giants, the real question isn't what was discovered in 1856. It is what else lies beneath American farmlands. What other vaults? What other burial chambers? What other evidence was quietly erased before the age of systematic archaeology? The Iowa giants weren't just a frontier anomaly. They were accidental glimpses into history we were never supposed to remember. And now that glimpse is gone, buried beneath Governor Grimes's building, lost to institutional silence, forgotten by design. But the questions remain. Who built that vault? Who were those giants? And what knowledge died with them beneath the Iowa prairie?